This person asks, what's with the ending of Mark? And in brackets, he has 16, 9 to 20. So to make it as simple as possible for the sake of time, what we're seeing here is the fact that Mark 16, 9 through 20 is absent from some of our best Greek manuscript witnesses. You get to Mark 16, verse 8, and there's simply no more in these earliest manuscripts that we have. Now, that is pretty significant. The fact that it's missing from our earliest Christian texts. Now, let me preface that by saying it's in hundreds and hundreds of others, but when we're talking about textual criticism, it's the absences that make the most interesting investigations. What else can I say? Well, along with that fact, that it's absent from the earliest copies of this section, starting up verse 9 and following of chapter 16, the text doesn't look anything like the style we've seen of Mark leading up to that point. So if Mark did write this longer ending of his gospel, then he's just decided to change his style completely at the very last minute. And this kind of stuff leads the vast majority of New Testament scholars to conclude that the last bit of the authentic part of Mark's gospel ends at chapter 16, verse 8. Now, let me say that those who do hold to that position differ about why it ends there specifically. And this is an interesting conversation. So for a while there, it was thought that even though New Testament scholars were convinced that the longer ending was later, they thought that the original ending had been lost. I actually know a few scholars who hold this position, that somewhere in the earliest period of the copying, the rest of the resurrection story had just been torn out of some of those early copies, and it just didn't continue on in the copying process, which really isn't that crazy of a theory if you think about it, especially if this was originally written on a scroll. It's not unreasonable to think that that could have happened. That kind of stuff happens in other instances with other ancient texts. And one of the clearest evidences for this theory is that the last word of verse 8 in English is translated, for they were afraid, afraid being the last word in the sentence. But in Greek, the last word in the sentence is for. The phrase is ephbonta gar. Greek, of course, not being like English where word order is pretty important. You can have things arranged the other way around in Greek. It's like that in some other languages too. German, for example. Word order isn't as important. But even in Greek, this is a little bit odd. It's like ending not only a sentence, or even better, ending an entire book with the word and. It's just strange. So some scholars concluded that it's just too unlikely that Mark would have ended his gospel in such an awkward way. That's the conclusion that they come to. But there is Oxford scholar Robert Lightfoot who wrote an article, I think it was in the 90s, although I could be wrong about that, where he makes some pretty strong, he makes a pretty strong case that it makes perfect sense for Mark to end with the word for. He actually argues that grammatically it's okay. It's not the best way to end things, but it's not completely erroneous to do so. And that's an interesting argument. But it was scholar Clayton Croy, actually, who wrote a book called The Mutilation of Mark's Gospel. I think it was back in 2003, and brought back this idea that Mark's Gospel was longer, and we've actually just lost the rest of it. So there is that theory. Other people think that Mark was just a little bit dramatic, a bit of a suspenseful genius, and ended his gospel account very abruptly, and sort of with this sense of mystery and expectation. I think the New English translation does a good job of translating this section like that. So the translation committee has the text rendered as, I used to have it memorized. Then they went out and ran from the tomb, for terror and bewilderment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. That's how the NET translation renders it. And ending things off very dark and dramatic. And I'm actually sympathetic to this theory because I don't think that the longer ending is original based on the manuscript tradition. I think the evidence bears out that it was a later addition, whether an attempt to rectify the abruptness of Mark's ending or an embarrassment that it says the women didn't tell anything to anyone. I mean, obviously they did tell someone because it eventually gets around to Mark. And the early church father Papias, or Papias, however you want to say it, tells us that Mark became the interpreter of Peter and wrote down what Peter remembered. So I think it makes more sense to read that as the women didn't tell anything to anyone until they go to the apostles. That's how I would read it. In other words, they didn't go around ranting and raving to just anyone. They kept it to themselves and made sure to tell Jesus' inner circle specifically. And I think that makes sense with what the other Gospels describe as well. I think if we see Scripture as a whole, that makes sense. The synoptic scholar, or at least he started as a synoptic scholar, he's definitely moved on to other endeavors. But for the arguments, for the sake of argument, let's call him that. The scholar Mark Goodacre, he makes an interesting observation when he talks about this subject by highlighting that maybe Mark was simply content with it being a bit of a cliffhanger, with ending in that sort of a abrupt way. And so he talks about other works of art that have been left unfinished, such as Schubert's Symphony No. 8, because Schubert ended it without a true finish, and it's not like he died or anything. In fact, there is a Symphony No. 9 in the lineup. And Goodacre proposes that this idea that Mark didn't truly know a good way to end everything is plausible. And the stories of the resurrected Jesus were still in the living memory of the eyewitnesses, and so those narratives were circulating. And there's this cliffhanger ending because it's a bit of an invitation for others to actually fill in the conclusion with their own remembrances or traditions about what happens next. And Goodacre actually thinks that what Matthew and Luke then do with their use of Mark's content and further elaboration in their own gospel biographies, that's what they're doing, as well as the further scribes in later decades that fill in what eventually makes its way into the manuscript tradition as what we now know as chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, the longer ending. I've also heard it theorized that Mark's gospel is actually written as a prequel to the creed that Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15. There it says that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised according to the scriptures. And then it goes on to list people that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12, and then to more than 500, and then to James, and then to all of the apostles, it says. So Paul's letter predates the Gospels, not in content, but in their writing. And if Paul is right that this is known around the churches more generally as something that he himself then repeated as of first importance, the idea that Mark is writing the prequel to all of that is an interesting one. And if you think about it, the actions of Mark 16 ends where 1 Corinthians 15 picks up. Because in 1 Corinthians 15, it starts off the eyewitness list by saying, and he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter. And that's a bit, and that bit we specifically don't have in Mark. There's a prophecy of Jesus appearing to Peter, but no more. So maybe Mark is writing this as a prequel, and there's no need to keep carrying on because the early Christians could just fill in the gaps where the common understanding within the oral tradition of the early Jesus communities of what happens picks up. That's an interesting theory, which is, yeah, it's just a cool thing to think about, I think. Yeah. And at the end of the day, I think the reason we see that the original ending of Mark stops there at verse 8 gives us a lot of confidence in the text of Scripture. I know a lot of people want to point out that differences in the manuscripts, which lead to citation notes at the bottom of the page in our modern Bibles, is problematic. But I truly think that that's not the case. I think the transparency we have in the text of the Bible is second to none. And that it's because of the wealth of information that we do have that we can have an incredible level of trust in the text to understand what the original authors wrote and what was added in at a later time. Therefore, it's because of the evidence that we know what the original authors wrote, not in spite of it. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.